The sun rose over the rolling plains of Apulia, its early light glinting off the bronze armor of soldiers who believed they were marching into a routine campaign. Rome, confident and relentless, had amassed an army larger than any Hannibal had faced before. They boasted 50,000 men, a sea of disciplined infantry, organized into rigid formations, their standards waving proudly in the morning breeze. Each legionary carried the weight of the Republic's pride, each officer a promise of Roman superiority. They had faced countless foes and emerged victorious, their reputation forged through relentless conquest. But today, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca had orchestrated a trap so perfect, so meticulously calculated, that history itself would remember it as a masterclass of strategy and bloodshed. Hannibal's army, smaller but fiercely disciplined, stretched across the plain with a deceptive calm. At the center, he positioned his weaker infantry, while his elite African and Spanish troops formed the protective wings. Cavalry, fast and lethal, waited on the flanks, barely moving, yet every man knew the plan by heart. Hannibal had studied Roman pride, understood their reliance on sheer numbers, and anticipated their overconfidence. He had led his men across the Alps, through snow and starvation, and now they stood ready to demonstrate why he was one of the greatest military minds the ancient world had ever seen. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension almost tangible, as both armies sized each other up across the dusty plain. Rome's commander, the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, felt the weight of responsibility. His counterpart, Gaius Terentius Varro, exuded youthful arrogance, eager to crush Hannibal before the enemy could solidify any advantage. The two men represented different philosophies of command. Paulus cautious, calculated, aware of Hannibal's cunning. Varro brash, impatient, confident in the disciplined might of Rome. As the consuls debated their approach, soldiers adjusted their shields and sharpened their spears, unaware that the coming hours would reshape the landscape of warfare itself. Hannibal's formation seemed fragile, the center slightly bowed, an intentional weakness that lured the Romans forward. Every detail had been considered: terrain, wind direction, the morale of men on both sides. The plain at Cannae was wide, open, and perfect for the Carthaginian trap. As the Roman legions advanced, they saw the apparent vulnerability and seized upon it, pressing their lines against Hannibal's bowed center. At first it seemed the plan had faltered. The Romans were stronger, pushing back Carthaginian infantry with brutal discipline, each soldier stepping over the fallen, each standard advancing relentlessly. Hannibal watched quietly, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The trap closed with horrifying precision. On the flanks, Carthaginian cavalry surged, a storm of movement that encircled the Roman wings. The Romans, trained for frontal engagement, struggled to respond to the sudden assault from unexpected directions. Fear rippled through the ranks as spears and swords cut from all sides. The Carthaginian infantry in the center, initially giving ground, pivoted inward, forming a deadly crescent that pressed the Romans into an inescapable pocket. Panic spread. Commands were shouted but lost in the cacophony of steel and screams. What had begun as a confident advance became a desperate struggle for survival. Men fought with unmatched courage, yet every movement played into Hannibal's design. The sheer size of the Roman force, which had once been their strength, became their curse. Surrounded, they could neither advance nor retreat. The ground became a churned battlefield of mud, blood, and the bodies of the fallen. Hannibal's tactical genius turned numerical advantage into a liability for Rome. Soldiers who had thought themselves invincible now found themselves trapped by an enemy half their size, fighting not just to win, but to survive. The discipline that had defined Rome seemed powerless against the orchestrated chaos Hannibal had unleashed. By midday, the slaughter reached its apex. The cries of men and the clash of bronze filled the air, a relentless symphony of destruction. Historians would later write that nearly 50,000 Romans fell that day, their deaths a testament to the brutal effectiveness of Hannibal's strategy. Yet for the Carthaginians, victory came at a cost. Though they had orchestrated one of history's greatest ambushes, even Hannibal felt the weight of the carnage. The battle was not merely a clash of armies, it was a spectacle of human ambition, fear, and the merciless calculus of war. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the field of Cannae lay strewn with bodies, a grim monument to strategy and sacrifice. Survivors wandered in shock, their weapons heavy, their spirits broken. Rome, shaken to its core, would not recover immediately, but the lessons learned from this day would echo for generations. Hannibal had proven that brilliance, cunning, and understanding of both human nature and battlefield geometry could outweigh sheer numbers. Cannae was not just a victory, it was a masterclass in warfare, a reminder that in the art of war, the mind can be mightier than the sword. While the dust of the battlefield still hung in the air, the Roman consuls struggled to comprehend the nightmare that had unfolded. Paulus, the cautious and experienced leader, had already seen the signs of collapse and tried to issue orders, rallying fragments of his army into defensive pockets. His eyes scanned the chaos, despair etching deeper lines into his face with each passing moment. Every attempt to restore order was met with confusion and resistance. Soldiers, exhausted and wounded, could barely hold their shields against the relentless Carthaginian assault. Varro, younger and impetuous, still pushed forward with reckless determination, demanding movement where movement was impossible, driving men into slaughter. The clash of strategy and recklessness, of caution and hubris, had sealed Rome's fate. Hannibal, positioned slightly behind the front lines, observed with a detached intensity. He had anticipated every Roman instinct, predicted every maneuver, and yet he remained vigilant, knowing that even genius requires adaptability. The Carthaginian cavalry, which had outflanked the Romans, now circled with precision, cutting off escape routes and striking terror into the hearts of men who had believed themselves invincible. Every step, every thrust of the sword was a note in a symphony orchestrated years in the making. Hannibal's mind, sharp and relentless, moved as fluidly as his army, seeing opportunities and dangers simultaneously. Amidst the chaos, individual stories of courage and desperation unfolded. A Roman centurion, shield cracked and bloodied, fought his way toward what he hoped was an opening, only to find it closed by walls of enemy soldiers. Men who had trained for years, who had marched across continents for Rome's glory, now clawed at the ground, trying to survive rather than win. In the center, the Carthaginian infantry maintained their disciplined push, bending their lines like living steel around the Roman attackers. Each Roman strike was met with calculated resistance. Each advance funneled them deeper into a pocket from which retreat was impossible. The psychological weight of encirclement began to crush morale. Soldiers who had never known fear now felt its full force. The discipline that had been Rome's greatest weapon became a prison. Rigid formations that were unbeatable in open battle became traps when the enemy controlled every angle. Panic spread like wildfire, and yet, even in the heart of the encirclement, acts of bravery and sacrifice shone briefly. Officers threw themselves into the fray to protect small groups, carrying the wounded and attempting last-minute breakthroughs. Hannibal watched these gestures with a cold respect, knowing that courage was inevitable in men, but that courage alone could not overcome the trap. As the sun reached its zenith, the field of Cannae transformed into a theater of carnage. Spears, swords, and shields collided relentlessly, carving paths through soldiers who had once been Rome's pride. Hannibal's cavalry pressed from the rear and flanks, hammering the Romans into submission. The ground itself seemed to resist the desperate movements of the trapped legionaries, churned into mud by thousands of boots, slick with blood. Hannibal's strategy relied not only on positioning but on human psychology, the tightening of the noose, the sense of inevitability that broke the spirit of men even before their bodies fell. Despite the chaos, some Romans fought with near mythical resolve. Units trapped on the flanks tried to hold ground, creating small pockets of resistance that slowed the Carthaginian advance. Yet each act of defiance played into Hannibal's hands, keeping the enemy focused inward while the outer ring closed. Carthaginian soldiers moved with lethal coordination, their eyes scanning for weakness, their movements synchronized with the general's vision. The battlefield was a dance of death, and Hannibal led every step. By afternoon, the scale of destruction became undeniable. Bodies piled high, shields shattered, swords dulled with repeated use. The Roman army that had seemed invincible that morning had been reduced to fragments, each soldier fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Hannibal's forces, though battered, retained cohesion, exploiting every opening with ruthless precision. The encirclement was nearly complete, escape was impossible, and Rome's greatest legions teetered on the brink of annihilation. As the sun began its descent, the horror of Cannae reached its peak. The Carthaginians methodically tightened their trap, driving the Romans toward the center, where the slaughter was most concentrated. Commands from the consuls became frantic, fragmented, and finally meaningless as the Roman soldiers were crushed from all sides. Hannibal had transformed the battlefield into a cage, the bars invisible yet impenetrable. Each movement of the Romans only accelerated their doom, and each act of Carthaginian precision magnified the carnage. When the day ended, Cannae was left in a grim silence. The once mighty Roman army was shattered, tens of thousands dead, the survivors scattered and broken. Hannibal had achieved one of the most devastating victories in military history, his strategy remembered as a blueprint of tactical genius. Yet even in triumph, he understood the cost of war, the lives expended, the suffering inflicted, and the knowledge that history would judge both brilliance and bloodshed in equal measure. The morning after Cannae, the field was a haunting panorama of human suffering. Smoke from fires set to burn the dead mingled with the morning mist, creating a surreal haze that hung over the plain. Survivors, few and broken, stumbled from the carnage, their faces pale, their bodies bruised and bloodied. The weight of despair pressed on them. Many collapsed where they stood, unable to comprehend the sheer scale of loss. For Rome, the disaster was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake that shook the very foundation of the Republic. Letters would later describe mothers weeping for sons, senators pacing in disbelief, and soldiers arriving in villages to recount horrors so unimaginable that many refused to speak of them. Hannibal's victory had transcended the battlefield. It had struck at the heart of Rome itself. In the Carthaginian camp, Hannibal maintained the same calm, calculating demeanor that had carried him through the Alps and now Cannae. He walked among his troops, observing their fatigue and injuries, yet never allowing celebration to cloud judgment. Every soldier knew the significance of what had just occurred, but Hannibal was already thinking ahead. He understood that Rome, resilient and resourceful, would not surrender. The Republic's spirit was difficult to crush, even after such a catastrophic loss. His victory had proven his genius, but Hannibal's mind was already plotting the next moves in a campaign that would stretch over years, each maneuver designed to weaken Rome's alliances, to sow fear and doubt across the Italian peninsula. Rome's leaders, meanwhile, faced decisions with impossible stakes. The Senate, initially paralyzed by grief, debated strategy feverishly. Some urged retreat and consolidation, while others demanded immediate vengeance. The consuls who survived Cannae were charged with rebuilding morale and reconstituting forces from the remnants of shattered legions. Every decision carried weight. Rome's survival depended on resilience, innovation, and the ability to learn from mistakes without succumbing to despair. The disaster at Cannae had revealed the vulnerabilities of the Republic, but it also ignited a resolve that would define Roman tenacity for centuries to come. Meanwhile, Hannibal's mind turned to the broader strategy of attrition. He did not intend to march directly on Rome, understanding that the city's walls and defensive preparations would render a siege costly and uncertain. Instead, he sought to weaken Rome indirectly, through alliances, intimidation, and selective engagement. He encouraged disaffected Italian states to question their loyalty, showing that Rome was not invincible, that even its greatest armies could be destroyed. News of Cannae spread quickly, sowing fear across the peninsula, and Hannibal leveraged this psychological advantage as ruthlessly as any blade. The battlefield was no longer merely a place of physical confrontation. It had become a stage for manipulation and strategy on a grand scale. Amid the aftermath, tales of individual heroism emerged, stories that would endure for generations. Roman officers who had fought to the last breath, soldiers who shielded comrades despite hopeless odds, and Carthaginian warriors whose discipline had turned chaos into victory. All these narratives contributed to the epic tapestry of Cannae. History would remember Hannibal for brilliance, but it would also remember the courage, desperation, and humanity of the men caught in his deadly trap. These accounts transformed the battle from a simple military engagement into a saga of ambition, fear, and survival, capturing the imagination of all who heard it. Even as Hannibal prepared for further campaigns, Rome began to recover. Reinforcements were raised, new consuls appointed, and a strategy of resilience took hold. The Republic learned from its mistakes at Cannae, adapting its formations, tactics, and approach to future engagements. Hannibal's victories, though devastating, had awakened a Rome more determined than ever. The lessons of Cannae would influence military thinking for generations, shaping strategies, doctrines, and the understanding of how to balance numbers, terrain, and psychological pressure in the crucible of war. Cannae became more than a historical event. It became a symbol. For Hannibal, it was a testament to strategic mastery, a high point in a campaign that would define his legacy. For Rome, it was a moment of profound suffering, yet also a crucible from which resilience and innovation would emerge. The blood-soaked plains stood as a reminder of the human cost of war, the fine line between genius and tragedy, and the enduring truth that history is shaped not only by victories, but by the response to catastrophic loss. The echoes of that day reached far beyond Italy, influencing military leaders for centuries. Tactics first employed by Hannibal were studied by generals in distant lands, each attempting to replicate the perfect encirclement, the artful manipulation of enemy psychology, and the devastating impact of terrain and timing. Cannae became a case study in the lethal combination of intellect, discipline, and audacity, a warning and inspiration simultaneously. In the months following Cannae, Italy was a land of uncertainty and fear. The shadow of Hannibal's victory hung over every city, every village, every Roman citizen. Allies wavered, some swayed by the promise of Carthaginian power, others held back by loyalty to Rome yet trembling at the thought of a repeat disaster. Hannibal moved with calculated patience, understanding that fear could be as powerful as the sword. He treated conquered towns with strategic leniency, offering protection and incentives rather than indiscriminate destruction, fostering a reputation that encouraged defections without forcing bloodshed. This subtlety magnified the psychological impact of Cannae, showing that genius in war was not merely about killing, but about bending the will of men without striking a blow. Rome, however, was slowly rising from its ashes. The Senate, determined not to be broken, poured resources into rebuilding armies, training fresh recruits, and reinforcing the city's defenses. Consuls were appointed with renewed vigor, their mandate clear: Rome would not surrender, Rome would not falter, and Rome would learn. The Republic's response was meticulous and relentless. Where once Roman pride had led to recklessness, now strategy and discipline guided action. Smaller, more cautious engagements replaced the headlong charges that had doomed them at Cannae. Rome's leaders realized that survival demanded adaptation, that the lessons of defeat were as crucial as the victories that had come before. Meanwhile, Hannibal remained in Italy, maneuvering like a predator in a vast and unfamiliar landscape. His army, though victorious, could not afford complacency. Supplies were limited, reinforcements few, and the loyalty of allies fragile. Each campaign required balancing aggression with prudence, terror with diplomacy. He sought to strike where Rome was weakest, to isolate regions, and to force the Republic into strategic overreach. Yet even as he achieved remarkable victories, he could never fully capitalize on Cannae. Rome's resilience, its capacity to recover and reorganize, proved formidable. Hannibal had won the battle, but the war remained uncertain, a complex dance between brilliance and endurance. Stories from survivors circulated, carried on the wind and through whispered conversations in towns and camps. Tales of courage, cunning, and unimaginable loss shaped the collective memory of Cannae. Roman soldiers who had escaped the slaughter returned to their homes, recounting the horrors, the brilliance of Hannibal, and the desperate heroism of men who fought to the last. Carthaginian soldiers spoke of discipline and cohesion, of executing a plan so precise it seemed almost supernatural. The legend of Cannae grew rapidly, transcending the immediate tactical victory to become a symbol of strategy, human endurance, and the fragility of even the mightiest armies. Hannibal's brilliance inspired awe, but it also carried its own burden. Every move had to be precise, every engagement calculated, for mistakes could be fatal in a land far from Carthage, with Rome ever vigilant and determined to strike back. The general's mind, sharp and unrelenting, weighed every possibility, every contingency. He understood that while a single battle like Cannae could echo through history, sustained campaigns required vision, patience, and an intimate understanding of both men and terrain. His genius lay not only in executing the perfect ambush, but in the unyielding attention to detail, the relentless foresight that defined every decision he made. For Rome, Cannae became a turning point not just militarily, but culturally and politically. Leaders who survived the disaster learned humility and pragmatism. Citizens, confronted with the fragility of their republic, found renewed purpose and unity. Rome's recovery was not immediate, but it was inexorable. Each new legion, forged in the aftermath of loss, carried the memory of Cannae as both a warning and a guide. The psychological weight of defeat shaped strategy, reinforced discipline, and fostered innovation in ways that would ultimately define Rome's military character for centuries. Yet the plains of Apulia remained silent witnesses to the carnage. Seasons passed, crops grew, and life returned in its slow, indifferent way. But the echoes of Cannae lingered. The memory of tens of thousands of men lost, of bravery and blood, of a trap so perfectly executed that it became a timeless lesson, remained embedded in the consciousness of all who lived through it. Hannibal's victory had reshaped the landscape of war, proving that intellect and strategy could rival and even surpass brute strength and numbers. The Battle of Cannae was not merely a battle. It was a study in human nature, in the intersection of courage, fear, ambition, and intellect. Hannibal continued his campaign in Italy with the quiet confidence of a man who had achieved the impossible, yet always aware that the republic he had sought to humiliate was far from defeated. Rome would rise as it always did, but Cannae remained an eternal testament to the power of strategy, the devastation of warfare, and the fine line between triumph and catastrophe. In every subsequent engagement, the shadow of that blood-soaked plain lingered, a reminder that even the mightiest could fall to the cunning of one extraordinary mind. The Battle of Cannae stands as one of history's most extraordinary demonstrations of strategy, courage, and human tragedy. Hannibal's brilliance reshaped the understanding of warfare, proving that intelligence, planning, and foresight could overcome even overwhelming numbers. Yet beyond the tactical genius, Cannae reminds us of the profound cost of war, the lives lost, the families shattered, and the world forever changed by a single day of violence and cunning. For Rome, Cannae was a crucible. It tested the Republic's resilience, its capacity for adaptation, and its enduring spirit. Though the army had been annihilated, Rome's response would become legendary, showing that true power is measured not by a single victory, but by the determination to rise again in the face of devastating defeat. For Hannibal, Cannae was the apex of his military genius, a testament to his understanding of men, terrain, and the delicate art of manipulation in battle. The plains of Apulia, once soaked with blood, have long since returned to quiet, yet the echoes of that fateful day persist through history. Through the strategies taught in military academies, the stories passed down by historians, and the enduring fascination of generations who marvel at both the brilliance and the horror of war. Cannae is not merely a battle. It is a story of human ambition, ingenuity, and the perilous cost of pride. In remembering Cannae, we remember more than numbers and tactics. We remember courage, fear, brilliance, and tragedy entwined in a single, unforgettable moment. The blood of tens of thousands may have been spilled on the Apulian plains, but the lessons of that day, of strategy, resilience, and the human capacity for both destruction and endurance, live on forever. Cannae remains etched into the annals of history, a timeless reminder that even in the darkest hours of defeat, the echoes of brilliance endure.